some 12 years ago, on my first visit to Gunung and therefore my first meeting with the Duke and brother-in-law, I was taken to visit the local graveyard, and the graves are what are now my father and mother-in-law. Indeed, it was at my mother-in-law's grave that I promised to take care of Maddie and her daughters. At the time, I don't know why I made this promise, but felt compelled to do so. Since that date, I've regularly visited these graves, even though other relatives don't as often, and Maddie never, due to fear of the graveyard and becoming possessed. As a result of the health crisis and spend a lot less time in Gunung I too have become an infrequent visitor to the graveyard. I do, however, make a point of visiting when we are particularly troubled by the paranormal. Thus, one morning I set off to pay my respects. But as I neared the graves of my father and mother-in-law, I spotted objects around them. As I scanned the graveyard, other graves also had the same objects, but the focus was on my parents-in-law. They were covered by sheets and herbs and bowls around their graves. I was immediately suspicious, taking videos of the evidence. I certainly felt this to be indicative of ritual being conducted at their gravesides. Thus, when I left the graveyard, I could feel myself being attacked by an entity, just as I had outside Mira Mutiara's Rumaduka, but this was a little stronger. I normally take wudu ablutions outside the graveyard, but the tap had been disabled. I therefore took wudu in the garden of a neighbour's home, and felt fine, but had not wanted to take the chance of bringing an entity back inside the house and to Maddie. And Maddie confirmed my suspicions on seeing the video that this was not a Muslim, nor even a traditional Javanese ritual. A brother and other three concluded that it was indeed evidence of the brother-in-law's necromancy, hinting that it was also evidence that he had killed both our parents using his black magic. The next day he moved all the paraphernalia from the graves. Our interpretation was confirmed by Parcano, who explained that I'd been attacked in the graveyard but not possessed. Could this also be what happened outside the Rumaduka? Concerning though this all was, I concluded that it was evidence of the Duke and brother following a Tantric left-handed path. Whilst cleaning the graves was necessary, I realised that however transgressive, it was not for me to judge. This was my Duke and brother's religion, and it's not for me to challenge his religious beliefs, despite almost all around condemning him. I have long known that Tantric practices influence Kajawa, but never fully appreciated how Tantric practices are found in Hinduism, Jainism and Buddhism. Tantra really just means a teaching. Nevertheless, the term is a relatively recent and coined by British colonists as a means of defining its transgression as being separate from mainstream religious devotion. Or you could see it as a technology about the discipline of the body, using the body to get closer to God. Shaivites see Shiva as the supreme God. It's esoteric, so the practice can only be revealed by a guru. There is a focus on non-dualism to achieve an alignment with God, or the essential oneness. In particular, the tantric practices include mantras, meditation, often merged with yogas, mandalas, chakras and kundalini. Tantra has a tradition of right and left-handed path. The left-handed path is seen as practices which are taboo, going against the norms, which would include alcohol, drugs, sexual rituals. Vajrayana, or Tantric Buddhism, represents a significant schism with early Buddhism. Theravada, which I was familiar with from Thailand. Vajrayana Buddhism arose in the 5th century India and strongly influenced Tibetan Buddhism. Tantric rituals are used to summon deities, even to become possessed by them, on your path to becoming a Buddha. These practices free us from the self and therefore to enlightenment. Whilst Buddhist monks have been celibate and non-violent, the left-handed path is a transgressive path, which includes ritualised espliebex and violence. Shaivism, especially Mantra-Magama Shaivism, like some other forms of Hinduism, spread to other parts of Southeast Asia, including Java and Bali. Indeed, the Majapahit Empire had Shaivism Buddhism as its central religion, which in many respects is the origin of Kajawan. This mixing of Hinduism with Buddhism, confusing the hell out of Westerners, and indeed some Hindus. But from a Tantric perspective, it's completely understandable. Even most Buddhists would understand this, while maybe not agreeing with the terms. Shiva is the Bharata Guru in Indonesia. Bharata Guru's wife is the Hindu deity Durga. She too has a complex character with the benevolent and fierce manifestations, each visualised with different names such as Uma, Shri, Kali, etc. I became convinced that the dukun brother-in-law was following a tantric, left-handed tantric path. His tattoo, rare in Muslim Indonesia, of Ganesh, with an inscription in Jawi, the ancient Javanese script, seemed to confirm this. You see, Ganesh is associated with the tantric path, and is often depicted seated on a bed of human skulls. Could he have allowed himself to become possessed by a deity? If so, was he following the commands of this deity? Would this mean that he was attempting to avoid samsara? Maybe even believing he was helping his victims to also avoid samsara? A simple child that lightly draws its breath and feels its life in every limb. What should it know of death? I met a little cottage girl. She was 8 years old. She said her hair was thick and curly, and many a curl that clustered round her head. She had a rustic woodland air, and she was wildly clad. Her eyes were fair and very fair, and her beauty made me glad. Sisters and brothers, little maid, how many may you be? How many? 7 in all, said she, and wondering looked at me. And where are they, I pray you tell? She answered, 7 we are. The 2 of us at Conway dwell, 2 of us are gone to sea. 2 of us in this churchyard lie, my sister and my brother, and in the churchyard cottage I dwell near them with my mother. You say at 2 at Conway dwell, and 2 are gone to sea, yet ye are 7. I pray you tell, sweet maid, how may this be? Then did the little maid reply, 7 boys and girls we are, 2 of us in the churchyard lie, beneath the churchyard tree. You run about, my little maid, your limbs are alive. If you are in the churchyard laid, if 2 are in the churchyard laid, you are only 5. Their graves are green, they may be seen, the little maid replied. 12 steps or more from my mother's door, and they are side by side. My stockings there I often knit, my kerchief there I hem, and there on the ground I sit and sing a little song to them. And often after the sun sets, sir, when it is light and fair, I take my little porringer. The first that died was Sister Jane. In bed she moaning lay, till God released her from her pain, and then she went away. So the churchyard she was laid, and when the grass was dry, together round her graves we played, my brother John and I. And then the ground was white with snow, and I could run and slide. My brother John was forced to go, and he lies by her side. How many are ye then, said I, if 2 are in heaven? Quick was little Mary's reply, Oh master, we are 7. But the dead are dead, those 2 are dead, their spirits are in heaven. 'Twas throwing words away, For still the little maid would have her will, and say, "Nay, we are 7." And that was William Wordsworth. Perhaps this was a convenience for me to see the brother-in-law as following his religion, that his actions weren't actually evil, but based on a misguided desire to do good. Yes, he was attempting to control others, which I can never condemn. But is this not the same sort of control imposed on the rest of us by politicians and elite? Could the desire for control be influenced by the complete lack of control over what most of us see as the real world? There is always a justification for what some would call evil, however illogical it may seem to most people. Indeed, aren't terms like magic, the devil and evil a convenience for not having taken the time to really think about what they really mean? When I first started to visit Indonesia, I would travel around the country looking for business, sometimes with Maddie at my side. Whilst I got involved with lots of projects, I never really made any money. Certainly not enough to cover my expenses in getting to and travelling within Indonesia. Thus I turned my attention to other parts of Southeast Asia. Again, sometimes with Maddie following me, combining work with pleasure. The problem wasn't really a lack of business, but too much business and my ability to identify which would result in me earning money. A real conundrum, as in most of Southeast Asia, the economy is structured so that only their elites have the opportunity to make money. Although in few countries is it as extreme as in Indonesia, where so many well-educated young Indonesians are not given the opportunity to engage in the economy, with the consequent negative effects on the economy of wasting so much talent, including my well-educated daughters, without having to make payments to get and keep a job. Perhaps I wasted the most time in Vietnam. In Vietnam, a very well-connected lady called Rose had used me as a middle-class white monkey. That is, using a white person in a suit to provide credibility to often dubious projects. I say dubious, but I really have no idea. As I was so in the dark and manipulated, I'll never know the truth. What I do know is that the only money I was ever given by Rose was to partially cover my expenses, although it was clear that Rose was claiming my expenses at grossly inflated prices. I did, however, have some work at the National University, who were very generous, although this was a long way from being a wage, let alone a living. Once I finally gave up any hope of making money in Southeast Asia, Maddie and I started to visit Bali. We visited Sanur many years previously, and had found a hotel which seemed really suited to us. Indeed, that part of Sanur seemed to match our Mitch heritage marriage. Nothing like as nice as the main part of Sanur, but as popular, if not more popular, with Indonesians as foreigner. There was also a lovely masjid, which at first I would only visit for Jumatan Friday prayers, but later started to visit every day. What really sold us on the hotel and the area was that we were immediately accepted by local bars, restaurants and businesses as being regulars. Something which would have been impossible in other parts of Bali, as hawkers and drivers would see me and shout, "Good day, mate. Taxi, Ubud, Luwata, Sarong, change money," or whatever else had proved to be a money spinner for them, even offering me a taxi to a bar when I was on my way to pray, and obviously in Muslim attire. In fact, we would stay at this hotel in our little corner of Sanur twice a year. This was disrupted for 2 years when Maddie lost her mind and was unable to travel. But as soon as she could, we resumed our pilgrimage. Not only did these visits seem to help Maddie to recover, they also had a very positive effect on me. Despite having now lived in Indonesia for a long time, my bahasa Indonesia is really not good enough to have a sensible conversation. In Sanur, I could continue to be a resident of Indonesia, whilst having conversations in English with people from all over the world. Well, okay, Australia, if I'm being honest. Furthermore, despite loving Indonesian food, I'd grown tired of it. When Bude took over the cooking, despite me being the good cook, and in Bali I could find a variety of foods, often in the same restaurant that Maddie could enjoy Balinese food in. The Boltol was taken away from us during the health crisis. The cheap flight from Solo ceased, but it was really uncertainty of the testing regime that I simply couldn't cope with. I think I was alright with testing before leaving, but testing in Bali before being allowed to return implied a loss of control over my life that I could not have coped with. Furthermore, masks were mandated in all public spaces, even some distinctly private. As far as I was concerned, I was not prepared to pay for a holiday to be subjected to such restrictions. As the restrictions increased, I was not allowed to visit Bali at all, and would have been barred from most public spaces should I have found a means of getting there. Before the crisis ended, our hotel went bankrupt and closed, and we did have a nearby alternative, but at times the cost was prohibited, especially as flights are now considerably more expensive. We had such happy times in this hotel, and returning there had been something of a pilgrimage. Indeed, it was here that Maddie told me about her life, and I would begin the process which ended in our marriage. Although in later years a lack of maintenance meant that our holiday was sometimes a little frustrating. Then everything started to get really crazy in Bali. For some time, policymakers have been making noises about high-value tourism. This morphed into almost daily rant by the Balinese administration, seemingly aimed at destroying the island's reputation amongst foreign tourists. They would argue that it was aimed at the wrong tourists, without ever considering the massive damage it was doing to Bali's reputation amongst all tourists. They seemed to believe that they needed to attract foreigners with the same views of their own, never considering that there are not enough racist snobs seeking to visit Bali year in, year out, and certainly not to buy Western brands in a mall at an inflated price. After exposing what a waste of money it had been to pay influencers to promote Bali as an unspoilt paradise to the average tourist, is only slightly racist and not so impressed by obvious elitism and ostentatious displays of wealth. Do you think I've gone too far? Certainly Indonesian readers will be reeling at my description of them as racist snobs. Well, let me profusely apologise. Indonesians aren't racist snobs, only their elite. As I was writing this, a member of this class held a traditional Javanese wedding ceremony in a Jakarta mall, costing $13,350. And maybe not a lot in the West, but a significant sum for most Indonesians. Indeed, only slightly less than what I budget for a family of four for the entire year. What is wrong, I hear you shout. The bride and groom were two Alaskan Malumites. I guess the insult from Bali were only words, but when foreigners started to be deported, I no longer considered it safe to visit Bali. In fact, hatred towards foreigners was being whipped up, claiming they were being disrespectful of Balinese culture, often engaging in activities arranged by the Balinese, or at least Indonesian businesses. An election was coming up, and these outbursts and actions seemed to mirror what I had experienced in Jakarta during the previous election. I also knew that while such tensions resided somewhat after the election, things never returned to how they had been previously. It also coincided with a $10, or was it 15, levy being introduced to foreigners visiting Bali to support local culture. A local culture, from what I can see, has been savagely destroyed by progressively Indonesian governments and their cronies. But then blaming foreigners for everything that goes wrong has become a national pastime in Indonesia. What made no sense at all was at the same time as tourists to Bali suddenly became disrespectful to local cultures, so did tourists, presumably from different countries, in Amsterdam, Rome and Spain. Could this be the effect of them having the health issue? Long-term, climate change, or their insistence on using cash? Authorities in each of these tourist locations also emphasise responsible tourism and their desire to encourage high-value tourism. Let me be clear, I do not consider myself a sea theorist, despite being accused of this, nor do I want to start a theory. But this does appear to be evidence of some collusion. And maybe I'm correct, and it simply indicates that many tourist destinations have employed the same consultants. But then this would suggest that these consultants have also advised on the interpretation and implementation of local laws. As always, evidence of foul play began to filter through, and it would seem that some of those being deported had been set up. For example, some were deported for not wearing crash helmets, despite Indonesians themselves not wearing them. But then there'd been a spate of crash helmet thefts on the island. Inexplicable, as crash helmets are inexpensive, and the Balinese are in general not prone to this sort of crime. Furthermore, often those who had had their helmets stolen were also the ones stopped by the police, sometimes almost immediately. Those deported included long-term Indonesian residents like myself. In this case, it was claimed that a resident of 23 years did not speak Bahasa, when in fact she was fluent in Bahasa. I knew from Davina's experience that deportation was no joke, was not the joke we all assume it to be, but a black mark which can stay with you forever, not only in the country that has deported you. Near to where our hotel had been became a special economic zone, and the Bali Beach Grand Inner Hotel was being developed into a national hospital by the Mayo Clinic. The logic being that rich Indonesians were going to Singapore for treatment, so an international hospital would keep their spending in Indonesia. Undoubtedly true, but do rich Indonesians need the tax subsidy of a special economic zone for their luxury healthcare? It wasn't long before the Mayo Clinic announced that they were only consultants to the project and not investors in it, clearly distancing themselves from deliberately misleading PR. So who were the actual investors? Well, at least on paper they're international, as the legislation permitting the recruitment of foreign expert doctors was dependent on the ownership being from outside Indonesia. Although I guess this would include money held offshore by Indonesians, of which there are probably far more than within Indonesia. Indeed, could the special economic zone be less about healthcare than repatriating offshore capital? Later, the requirement of foreign investment to recruit foreign doctors was relaxed. But to my mind, this only increases the fog surrounding who is actually benefiting from the special economic zone and not making it more transparent. Around the same time, it became apparent that Russian oligarchs were investing in Bali. Money and people had fled Russia following the invasion of the Ukraine, and Bali had got far more of its fair share of both. The young Russians fleeing conscription fueled the locals' outrage regarding the behaviour of foreigners. Now, I have a friend who lives in Bali, and he assures me that many of these young Russians were very badly behaved, which, having played online games with young Russians, I can believe. Some had sought work in Indonesia, something the authorities are now becoming very strict on. including for long-term residents like myself, with Indonesian families to support. But then ask the Spanish and they will have similar stories of UK tourists. Yes, there is some truth in the accusation of bad behaviour, but parts of Spain, along with parts of Bali, were founded on and catered to budget tourists and their bad behaviour. Such stories not be inspired by competition and divisions within the tourism industry, with local governments clearly siding with the larger companies aimed at higher value tourism. Given there is no transparency, we will never know the exact nature of these Russian investors. But their investments were patrolled by Indonesian preymen, gangsters, employed as security guards, forbidding tourists from even taking photos of their impressive investments, almost as though they had something else to hide, such as the source of the capital, and that it was being invested outside Russia. In fact, the use of preymen suggests a schism in Bali between these Russian investors and Indonesian investors in Canggu, somewhat led by and certainly represented by the celebrity lawyer Hotman Paris, with Balinese authorities seeming to have sided with the Russians, but being too frightened of directly facing a celebrity lawyer with a fierce reputation, both on winning unwinnable cases and his amorous liaisons. Whatever the truth, Bali no longer feels like the welcoming respite from Jakarta it once was. Indeed, in so many respects, it's becoming just like Jakarta, with a huge new development by biome. So why visit? I recall a Ghanaian saying which seems to fit perfectly. When the elephants fight, it's the small animals that get trampled on. Well, that concludes this chapter. Now, I want to emphasise this is a novel. I have referred to real events and real life people, and I've actually used their names, but these are well documented. At other times, I've based characters on actual people, but they're amalgams, and if anyone's insulted, I'm really sorry. That was never my intention. But as I say, it's just a yarn for your entertainment.